Okay, I want to pick up where we left off on our long roundabout lecture the other day. But I think we did get a good background on the scapegoat ritual, where how that originates, the function of it, um, and I think one of the big takeaways is this idea that in certain cultures, kingdoms, if you will, um, when things aren't going right, ancient cultures had this practice of trying to get at the root of what might be incurring the divine wrath, so to speak, whether they believed in a monotheistic God like Yahweh in ancient Israel, or whether they believed in some pantheon of gods and fertility deities. Okay, so if something was going wrong, like famine, disease, it had to be the result of an ailment of some kind, perhaps a moral shortcoming. It could be the result of some sort of wrongdoing or sin. And the way that they purge this is through the killing of an innocent lamb, perhaps, as in the Bible. And in some cultures, even, it was killing the king and reinstating a new, sort of fresh king, who is full of life and then can therefore rejuvenate the country. And this is a motif or a pattern, an archetypal pattern, archetypal in that it's kind of universal, and this idea appears in many different cultures. And so we're going to tie this into Hamlet momentarily. I know my graphics aren't super exciting, but you're going to have to use your imagination. Um, Amletus, Omelet, Amlodi. Okay, these are all different names for like the sort of the early derivatives of the name Hamlet. Storm King School, Dean on duty. So these are ancient Scandinavian names that come up in the research on the origins of this story. Now, Shakespeare did not come up with the plot of Hamlet per se, and this tale of a brother killing the king and the prince having to enact revenge. Okay, that basic scheme dates way back. And what's interesting is that these older versions of Hamlet, um, taking place in ancient Scandinavia, these plays or the storytelling, which was highly ritualized at certain times of the year, in particular during the winter months, okay? And there was a way of creating some sort of catharsis for the anxiety that is provoked by very long and severe winters. Okay, so just to reiterate a little bit about what we talked about before, is that um, in essence, performing these rituals and reenacting these tragic legends was a way for these cultures, specifically in Scandinavia, to channel their anxiety about the darkness that's prompted by the winter, and to try to exert some sort of maybe a psychic control over nature, or at least trying to acknowledge that they are themselves like a part of this natural process, and that they are wishing and hoping that the cycle will continue to perpetuate for the next round. Because if not, then it means things stay dark and cold, and death comes after that. And there was also a really interesting detail in that the bloody aspect of these stories, spilling blood on the ground in some sort of ritualized matter or performance, that almost was seen as a way of fertilizing the barren earth. Spilling of this life force onto the barren earth in wintertime might allow for it to grow back again in the next spring. So important then to be able to note that Hamlet is something that's connected to these old ancient tales that are all wrapped up in our human and primal anxiety over the darkness that comes with wintertime. This is the work of the mythological and archetypal critic, is to try to understand what it is within human beings that prompts them to create these stories. And what is it about these stories that prompts humans to return to them again and again and again? There is something about this tale, this pattern that's presented in Hamlet, that still appeals to our psyche, according to these mythological critics. And so this is their way of explaining why it holds such an intense fascination for us even in the modern era. Okay, so we are going to move from the ancient Scandinavian days to the era of Queen Elizabeth. And it's really important then, as a myth critic or archetypal / mythological critic, to understand the mindset of the Elizabethan audience. And I want to say up front that they lived in a very different world than we did, and obviously, but it would be, I just can't underscore or emphasize how different their world was compared to ours. Just almost a totally separate reality with a wholly different set of beliefs and ideas about what the world actually is and the fabric of reality. I mean, it was just very, very, very different from what we have today, which then we should then be asking, how might future generations then look at the way that we view the world? And if you have that mindset, it's pretty humbling, because we really don't know a whole lot after all, as much as we think we do. But one of the very interesting and I think rich aspects of these olden days in the Elizabethan era was the literacy that the common people had for symbols and mythology. They caught all of the allusions and all of the symbolic references in Hamlet. And these are things that are often lost on modern readers. Okay, very much present in the minds of the Elizabethan theater goer was the myth of divine appointment. When the audience finds out that Claudius is the bad guy who has killed a king, okay, they can't help but think, well, what if something like that would happen in our time? What if Queen Elizabeth would be killed, and she's divinely appointed, something, and they understand that there's consequences for interfering and messing around with the divine laws. So they get to live out sort of vicariously through the Hamlet tale what might happen if the divine appointment is messed with, and they're going to see the disaster that follows messing around with the decree of God. And so when Hamlet starts to develop, the play Hamlet develops, we see that the ultimate crime is committed, the killing of a king, but it's even made worse by the fact that it was fratricide, which is even a higher level of betrayal. And the consequences are social, political, and natural chaos. And we do see the social chaos in Hamlet. Of course, we see all of the political machinations going on, and it is quite chaotic. Fortinbras ultimately wins the day because of the political chaos. And how might we describe the social chaos going on in Hamlet? Well, Hamlet himself embodies some of that in his mistrust of everything and everyone, except for maybe Horatio. Ophelia, even, and the insanity that follows her grief over the loss of her father, the loss of Hamlet, Hamlet's madness. All of these things, represent social chaos. And Hamlet even turning on his friends Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, and Rosencrantz and Guildenstern even, plotting and spying on Hamlet. Natural chaos, maybe not quite as obvious because, but we see it in the language. Okay, we have this famous line, "Something's rotten in the state of Denmark." We hear Hamlet calling Denmark an unweeded garden. There's lots of other examples of contagion, disease imagery, corruption, the serpent, Claudius, which led to, in Adam and Eve in Genesis, their being kicked out of the garden. And it was like the serpent who precipitated this loss of innocence and invited in all of the terrible things that ruined the perfection that existed in the Garden of Eden. Okay, so when you follow through with looking at Hamlet in this way as an example of what can happen when you mess with the divine order, okay, well, how do people get themselves out of such a mess? Well, it's not going to be pretty. And this is where we get the idea of the scapegoat sort of personified into this figure of the sacrificial hero, which myth critics would argue is Hamlet. And perhaps this explains his long delay, because it takes him a while to come to grips with his destiny, which is to be able to give himself up, to sacrifice himself if need be, in order to purge the state of Denmark. And he does say, "O cursed spite that ever I was born to set it right." But in order for Hamlet to finally get to the point where he's willing to give his life, he needs to learn what he needs to learn. He needs to go on this sort of journey of self-knowledge, self-discovery. It's the hero's journey. Hamlet has to be with the darkness of his soul, so to speak, this descent inward. But this leads him to mature, and I think we see that in the last conversation he has with Horatio, where he says everything has got some kind of hidden divine message, even the fall of a sparrow, but human beings can't know what it is. We just have to be prepared for anything. And that's pretty much the last thing that he says philosophically in the play. And so Hamlet goes, he's killed, and in the killing, others are killed, the state is purged, and he, in essence, is redeemed because of his sacrifice.